I wonder if I was to go around the room and invite a number of you to share what the most life-defining moment you've experienced so far is, what you'd say. What's been the moment, way more than perhaps one moment, moments that have defined your life and set you on a trajectory that you could not have expected. I don't know what sort of things would come out. It would be an amazing thing to do, I'm sure. Here is a photo of Rosa Parks. Some of you will know the Rosa Parks story. It will get here in a minute. Slides. The story of Rosa, she grew up in Montgomery County, Alabama. She was, like me, an ordinary person going about doing her life. And one morning, she decided to do something really brave. She was living in 1950 in the 50s, and this was in 1955. There, in that state, particularly of Alabama, segregation laws were particularly strict. Rules designed to keep white people and black people as far apart as is ever possible. An evil policy that we would now say, how on earth did that even make any sense to anybody? Side note, let's not for any moment assume that we've conquered the problems, the evils of racism. We haven't. But she that morning decided enough was enough. She got on a bus, and the rules were this, that if the white seats got filled up and there weren't enough white seats for white people, then coloured people had to go to the back of the bus and give up their seat. And if there were no more seats at the back of the bus, they had to get off. Outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. One morning she said, no, I'm not moving. And if you've ever done something super brave, you'll know that you have this adrenaline that surges through you. And then this moment of doubt kicks in and you think, what have I done? What have I done? Well, what she did was enough to unlock the way for the civil rights movement. We give thanks for her. What would your life-defining moment be? Sometimes they're chosen, and sometimes they're not. We've heard about Peter from that reading from the Bible. We'll come back to that in a moment. Peter, of course, Saint Peter, who now has this full-time job guarding the pearly gates of heaven. Here's a photo of him busy at work, coming up on the screen. That's obviously not true. It's not in the Bible that, Peter guards the gates. If you can see that, it says, sorry, your username and passwords don't match. It's terrifying enough when that happens in the middle of a stressy moment, but imagine at the end of your earthly life being told that you've got the wrong password. That's not how it works. That's not what Peter's doing. Actually, we're talking about this Peter, Saint Peter, the Apostle Peter, one of the heroes of the early church. One commentator describes him as the underestimated apostle, probably because Paul, the Apostle Paul, gets an awful lot of attention and time, and rightly so, he's amazing. But Peter is equally incredible, and many of us don't know the full story. And if you were to ask Peter, if great Saint Peter was here today, imagine we had two stools and I was able to interview him, and I was to say, Peter, can you tell us the life-defining moment in your story? What was the defining moment of your life? I'm pretty sure he'd say, well, it was one morning. It was one morning on the side of a lake. I'd just been out fishing. And I had this extraordinary encounter with grace. I wasn't expecting it. I didn't deserve it. I didn't even realize in the moment what was happening. I should have realized Jesus was up to something when we landed on the shore and I could smell charcoal from the fire because he was kindly trying to undo something that I had done. And what he'd say is, to understand that life-defining moment, which we'll come to in a minute, you actually need to understand that there's a backstory. There was a moment earlier in my story that I thought at the time, and for quite a while, was the life-defining moment. A moment of my own making that I regret deeply. One of the pastoral principles that I always kind of teach our curates here as they learn how to pastor well is that there is always a backstory for every single person and every single moment. You know this, right? So if I was to go and tell me your story, you'd say, well, I need to give you some context. I need to tell you the backstory. There's always a backstory. We need to remember that when we're meeting with one another, when we're connecting with one another, when sometimes our behavior presents as one thing. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Extend some grace. What is the backstory here? It's usually one of pain and of loss. Peter had a backstory, and he'd say this: it was one evening. It was the evening of the Last Supper. We'd had dinner with Jesus, he would tell you, and we were on our way to the Mount of Olives. We were heading there before we got to the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus had stuff for us to do, and we read about this in Matthew 26. It'll come up on the screen. Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." Peter, if you know the story, young Peter was this feisty, tempestuous, heartfelt guy. And he's like, "No way, Jesus." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. Peter's the keen one. Peter was the committed one. Peter is the one who was the first to walk on the water. Do you remember that story that out on a lake in a storm, Jesus appears to them and he says, "Get out of the boat and walk to me." And Jesus is like, "Okay, that's Jesus. I'll walk to him." Peter's full of faith. He's the all-in one. He didn't always get it. There are moments where he gets it spectacularly wrong. Literally later on in the garden when they come to arrest Jesus, he doesn't really realize what's going on, and so he gets out his sword and cuts off the ear of the servant of the great high priest, and Jesus is like, no. Side note, has to quickly heal the guy, and no, Peter, but he's all in. And then there's this moment, just a few hours later. How does that work? Because Peter is the one who went all in because he was the one who first saw who Jesus was. So we read this back again, further in the story, Matthew 16. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" "Well," they replied, "some say John the Baptist, etc." Then he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." How does Peter go from that to this moment, that evening that he thought defined his life? Because Jesus, in hearing Peter's declaration, makes a declaration then of who Peter is going to be. Notice it carries on. "You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. Now I say to you that you are Peter," which means rock. "And upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. And then there's all this talk about keys, which is where we get that mythology about him guarding the gates and all of that from. Pretty sure those words, huge words, which we'll come back to in a moment, spoken over Peter back in the day, would have suddenly been ringing around in his head and charging around in his heart as he realizes in this moment that he'd been anything but a rock. Jesus has literally said to him, "You will disown me 3 times this evening." The kindness of God to even give him heads up. And then here we are, Matthew 26, the moment that that Peter thinks is life-defining. So Jesus has been arrested. He's been taken off to the Sanhedrin, set ready to go on trial. And we read this, verse 69. Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath. "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." Immediately, a rooster crowed. And then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And it says this: he went outside and wept bitterly. He's literally positioned himself, being the all-in, committed, "I see who you are, never, Jesus, I'll die with you." And then several hours later, disowns him entirely. Can you imagine what he felt in that moment? The shame, the guilt, the fear. Oh my God, what have I done? And in that moment, this question must have gone through his head. Is that it? I'm done, aren't I? I'm out. I blew it. There's no coming back from this. Not a chance. Like, never mind Jesus. I don't think the other guys would give me grace. They're giving me another chance. I mean, like the rock? You're kidding. I'm not a rock. Fear kicks in and speaks this lie, I'm sure, to Peter, and says, "This moment's defined you. See, this is who you are. You're not rocky, you're sandy. Jesus can't build on you." I'm pretty sure he'd have been remembering that parable. That moment of realization, he even told me. Maybe you've got moments that you can remember in your story where you can kind of relate. Probably not quite as severe as literally disowning the Messiah of the whole world, but similar moments, perhaps, where you've denied Jesus, or you've done something that you shouldn't have done that's cost you and others, or maybe you've been in a moment where someone's done something to you and you've thought, "This is now a defining moment for me and I'm a victim of them." And fear has kicked in and shame has kicked in and you've thought, "That's it, I'm done, aren't I? I'm out. I am now just resigned to being on the back benches of humanity, making up the numbers, hoping that someone might just let me keep coming along. It's okay, I'll just sit at the back. But that's it, I'm just..." What I want to tell you this morning is that is not how it works in the kingdom of God. That is not how Jesus works. And so we come to our teaching text. before we look at what Jesus does, how Jesus moves towards Peter and extends grace into his life. There's a few things you need to notice, and hopefully you've still got that teaching text open before you. Peter, it says earlier in that chapter, was out fishing with his friends. He's not gone out fishing to relax. Jesus first met Simon Peter and his fisherman buddies when they were where? On the side of a lake, having been fishing. And so Peter's gone back to the day job, because by this point, they don't know that Jesus is risen. They don't really understand what's going on. They think the revolution's over. It was good while it lasted. We'd better go and catch some fish. Jesus first met Peter on the side of a lake, and he invites him to follow him. And so he does. And here we are. Jesus meets him again on the side of a lake. And we're meant to notice another parallel, because we're meant to remember that story I referenced earlier, where there's a storm and Jesus appears to them on the side of the shore, and he calls Peter out of the boat. Notice what happens in the story, if you know the story. Peter sees that it's Jesus. It's actually John that spots it first, which is why you have this interesting dialogue in John about who loves Jesus the most? Who does Jesus prefer? John's got this kind of like, I think it's me thing going on slightly. It's interesting. John spots that it's Jesus. Peter goes, yeah, it's Jesus. What does he do? Jumps in the water. Doesn't walk this time. His faith's probably not high enough. But he wades out instinctively towards Jesus because he's seen him again. The Messiah. He's conquered death like he said he would. And then there's this great little moment, because basically it says Peter then gets back in the boat to go and help bring in the haul. I can pretty much imagine all the others going like, Peter, whoa, hang on a minute. Like, we need you in the boat, you joker. Mr. Rocky. What does he do? He wades out. Why? Because he's seen Jesus. He gets back into the boat. They bring this haul of fish to the side. And then Jesus says, come, let's have some breakfast. There's a little detail in Luke's account of the denial moment that helps us see something in this story. It says this: then they seized him, Jesus, and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. He went and hid in the crowd around a fire. There they are, verse 9 of this chapter, the end of John. When they landed, it says, they saw a fire of burning coals. I don't know, but I'd like to think Jesus paid some attention to some detail. That Peter might just have a moment, a little hint of what was to come. Peter, do you see what I'm doing here? You're sat around a fire, and I'm right here with you. We're meant to see all those parallels. And I don't know, but I wonder whether Peter noticed anything at all before then, the moment we had read to us earlier. They'd finished eating. And Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Simon, son of John, do you love me? What you need to understand is this is not a test. This was not a moment where Peter gets to go, yeah, do you know what? Since that terrible moment, I've been away, I've done some soul searching. I've been on a few courses. Anyone ever done a speed awareness course? Everyone's like, oh, no, put your hand down. No, I'm in church. Don't confess that. Probably all of us. You know, it's behavior modification, right? Like, I've got no idea. Obviously, I've just heard about them. It's not that kind of deal. It's not like Peter's going, yeah, look, I've been working on myself. I've seen a therapist, and I've done some work, been on a few courses. Look, I've sorted myself out. No, what's going on here is that Jesus is saying to Peter, do you want to try again? Do you love me? That's all he needed from Peter. He gets asked that question 3 times. Why? Well, you know this, I'm sure. Some of you will have heard this sermon before from someone else. 3 questions for the 3 denials. 3 mad moments in Peter's life that for a while would have haunted him, suddenly become 3 moments that in just one moment with Jesus get wiped out. Because that's how powerful grace is. And what happens is that Jesus asks him a specific question. We lose it in the English, but in the Greek we have some insight into what is going on. So the first time that Jesus asks him the question, it's, Simon Peter, do you agape me? Which is one of 8 Greek words for love. And it's this sense of selfless giving love, sacrificial love. It's the highest form of Christian love, agape. To lay down one's life for one's friends, says Jesus. That's what true love is. God so agaped the world that he sent his one and only Son to die for us. It's sacrificial, self-giving love. There are others, aren't there? There's eros love, from which we get erotic, but it's meant to be about sexual love. There's all sorts of others. But the 2 that we hear in this story are agape and phileo. Peter, do you agape me? Will you sacrifice your life for me? And Peter replies, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. But the word he uses there in the first and second answers is phileo, which means brotherly, sisterly love. I love you as a brother, as a sister. I see you as family, and I am committed to you till I die. So he says, yes, Lord, I phileo you. He can't in that moment say, with integrity probably, I agape you, because he's sat there thinking, but I said that once before. I said I'd die with you. And then I denied you. I'm not sure Jesus is ready to say I can agape you again. I'm just still getting my head around that you're even here and that we're even having this conversation. So he answers the first time, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. Okay, well, take care of my sheep. Same question. Do you agape me? Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. And then the third time, Jesus changes the question. And he says this. Simon, son of John, do you phileo me? And it says this. Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the question differently the third time. What's going on there? I think what's going on there is that Jesus meets Peter where he's at. Grace finds a way. Grace always finds a way. He sees Peter. He sees that Peter's there. Peter's wanting to say, he wants to be able to say, I can agape you, but he can't. But he can say, I phileo you. I can say that. And so Jesus is like, I can work with that. That's enough. I'll meet you in that moment. That is good news for you and I, because we have moments where we come back to God, don't we? Or we find that grace comes towards us. And we know that in the depths of our heart, we want to be able to say something, but we have this check in us because we daren't believe it, because we don't trust ourselves. And God's grace will find a way to pull you in, to meet you where you're at. It always finds a way. Peter encounters grace in that moment. Jesus does the heavy lifting. he takes what Peter can give and he says, I will do the rest. Okay, that I can work with that. That's enough. Welcome back in. Jesus lowers the bar so that he can find a way. And in 3 minutes, Jesus undoes those 3 moments. In 3 days, Jesus undid all the madness of sin and death and evil. It doesn't take much for Jesus. All-powerful, all-knowing. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Grace compensates for our failures. Peter is transformed not by his performance, but by Jesus. And he says, you're still rocky. I see you as a rocky one. I can build on you. That's, by the way, what I think is going on there. I don't think Peter was the only rock. And that's the whole papacy conversation. Now, I think Jesus saw Peter as rocky. And he looks at you and he goes, if you put my teaching into practice, you're rocky. You can build. I can build on you. Here's the point, friends. We are not defined by our worst moments. We're not defined by those things we don't get right, those things we don't do, or those things we did that we shouldn't have done, those things we said that we shouldn't have done. We're not defined by those moments if we let God in. If we let God in, if we come to God in humility and repentance, grace and mercy triumph over judgment. And that is good news, because each and every one of us need to hear that over and over again. Jesus agapes us. Agape love. And he invites us to agape him back and to agape the world. You are not defined by those moments. You're defined, or to be defined, by who Jesus says you are. He says, Peter, you're the rock. You're not defined by your worst moments, by your CV, by your performance. Thank goodness. And grace wants to enter into your life and mine and transform us, to take all those worst moments, to redeem them, to cancel out the debt, and to set us free, that we might agape. And some of you are carrying stuff from perhaps a long time ago that you don't think, but need to pay attention to some degree or another, is still defining you. And after the worship time, there'll be a chance for you to get prayed for, to come before God and go, I'm back. I see you on the shore of my life. And I want to walk towards you today. And I might only be able to say I can filio you, but I think that might be enough. If you know the rest of the story, Peter's story, he becomes truly rocky. He becomes this extraordinary leader who agapes Jesus so beautifully for the rest of his life. He preaches the first sermon at Pentecost. Thousands come to faith. He's one of the first apostles. He's the first bishop of Rome. That's the whole Pope thing again. I'm not dismissing it, please. I haven't got time. There's an RS teacher over there. Chris, he'd happily explain it to you. He helps the church grow, becomes a pastor to the leaders. He was held in such high regard. He was revered. He wrote 2 beautiful letters to the church, explaining who we are and what we are and why we're here. And I don't think he could have explained it so beautifully had he not got that story we've looked at. And tradition has it that when he was to be crucified in Rome under Emperor Nero, who blamed the Christians for the fire that destroyed Rome, We have no proof of this, but tradition is that he insisted on being crucified upside down because he did not think he was worthy to die in the same way as Jesus, that it needed to be harder. Agape, love. And you and I, we're invited to come as we are to receive agape love. And in a moment, we're going to stand and we're going to remember many, many brave people who laid down their lives, perhaps not for the Lord, but for you and for me. That is the highest form of love. But you need grace from God if you're to love like that.